Hey everyone, welcome back to CleanTechies. I'm Silas Mähner, your favorite CleanTech headhunter. Today's episode is a cross post from Nick van Osdol's podcast, Keep Cool. He interviewed me to get some of my takes on CleanTech broadly and also specifically to hear about hiring and talent. Before we start, a big shout out to our sponsors, including our newest sponsor, Layman's Terms. If you're doing media spots or doing some work on Capitol Hill, reach out to Michael and his team. They have prepared hundreds of executives for media appearances to ensure you don't go viral for the wrong reasons and that you capitalize on that specific moment. Learn more at ltmediatraining.com. Also, a big thanks to Climate Finance Solutions. Joel and his team are your first call whenever you're looking for help applying for grant funding. They have a 90% success rate and have helped clean tech startups raise over $1.6 billion since 2020. I'm probably going to have to update that number pretty soon here. We've been using that for a while. You can find the link to reach out in the description. And of course, EarthSearch, my recruitment firm. If you're struggling to find good talent for your team, people that actually know what they're doing, they've been there, they've done that, we can help you. Send me a message on LinkedIn or directly email me. And by the way, if you're not already familiar with Nick's work at Keep Cool, I highly recommend checking out his newsletter and podcast by going to keepcool.co. Really good stuff there. All right, enjoy the episode.
Welcome to the Keep Cool Show, the podcast in which we cover how cutting-edge climate technologies connect to the world in which we live. I'm your host, Nick van Osdol.
One other thing I would mention about culture building and everything, I talked about this a little bit with public-facing kind of wins and everything, is if you cannot find a way to truly pitch what you're doing at the early stages as like world-changing type of situation, it's going to be challenging for you. But if you can do it well, if you can say like, hey, there's this humongous market that is basically decaying and falling apart, and we are going to solve it. Even though you may be doing it from a climate lens, you can kind of attach it to the broader market. It just makes it calls people to adventure, right? Like humans, there's so many people out there there's a lot of people who just want to punch a clock and make some money and call it a day. But there's a lot of people who are not stuck in the matrix, and they're looking for something interesting. They're looking for adventure to call them out. And that is what draws in investors, but it also draws in early talent. And that's where you're going to find the types of early talent who, in some cases, they may not even have the technical skills, but they have such willpower that you need to bring them on. I was just listening to, I think, Brian Armstrong at Coinbase. Their first customer success guy was a lumberjack before becoming their customer success guy. And they were choosing between him and the person who ran customer success at Google. So it was like, it should have been an obvious choice to choose the person who did the job. But the guy who was a lumberjack was just like so motivated by Bitcoin that he's like, I'm going to do this. Like they were like, hey, we have to hire this guy. So that's the kind of thing that you can do if you are really good at positioning yourself in the market. I would say visceral, or that individuals are personally connected to, that there is some kind of direct, like my work will impact this particular visible thing that I can tangibly understand.
Welcome to the Keep Cool podcast. It's your host, Nick van Osdol, and today I'm super excited to be joined by Silas Mähner, who's the CEO and founder of EarthSearch, a clean tech recruiting firm, and the CleanTechies podcast. So 2 podcasters going at it today. Welcome to the show, Silas.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Nick. It's been a pleasure to know you over these past years, and also super excited to be able to come on your show finally.
Yeah, likewise. And yeah, I mean, we're certainly not the most seasoned folks in climate and clean tech and climate tech and all that jazz at this point, but it is an interesting place to start this conversation with that reflection on that we've been at it for a few years and perhaps not as bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, but still optimistic as we were at the outset. Yeah, why don't we just start there before we talk a little bit about, your journey to founding EarthSearch and all that jazz. I'm curious, sitting here in March 2026, like how has the landscape shifted and evolved in your time, having a lot of insight into it? Maybe what stayed the same?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can just go back a little bit. So when I first got involved, it would have been March. It was actually basically 6 years ago. So it's March 2nd, 2020 was when I moved out to New York City to start working in recruiting in renewable energy. And obviously a lot of other things happened in the following weeks there. But it was I would say that at the time, the word climate tech wasn't really invented yet to my knowledge. At least I know that Sophie and Kim kind of came up with the climate tech VC newsletter not that long after that, but it was still called CleanTech at the time, right? And it's kind of funny to me. It feels like we're going back to that again. We're going back to CleanTech being the thing because people, climate tech now has another negative connotation. So we've shed the clean tech 1.0 vibes for climate tech, and then now we're going back to clean tech in some ways. But that's my opinion on it, I guess. I don't know what your take is, but it is very fascinating right now to see how I honestly just don't know what to call it. Like what the landscape is right now is there's
Right.
still so many companies doing amazing things that are perfectly in line with clean technology and making the earth not die.
Right.
And they're not usually called clean tech companies anymore, right? And in some cases, they look like defense companies. So it's just a really, I don't know, it's an odd time. It's kind of like a wandering period, I guess you could say.
Yeah, no, I like that. I like that description of, I think there's certainly been narrative evolution over the years. And, before, because I got into the space at a similar time as you, sort of early 2020 to mid 2020. And we certainly haven't seen all the evolutions, right? Like there used to be Clean Tech 1.0 before us, and people use the word sustainability and all that stuff more. And I do think there is some cyclicality to it. And I do agree that folks, myself included, have sort of called into question, whether there needs to be an evolution from climate tech into something else. I think we're very much undecided as a space what that next thing will be. But I do think to kind of bring it all around, it's a product of what you're describing, where it's something that I think a lot of us would be happy to know if we'd been told that this would be the result in 2020. But some of the goals of the sort of clean tech 2.0 movement that sparked around that 2020 time were to convince companies, different stakeholders, investors, society at large, that a lot of the sort of, the intent of what clean tech and climate tech companies were doing were really things that like every company and all organizations should be doing. And I think that's actually happening to a degree. And that, I think, speaks to why, to your point, some of it feels like it's just being absorbed into other industries. And it makes it a little bit less like demarcated these days. Like not every company is out there saying we're climate tech, but they may well have, a lot to offer in the way of making the world, supply chains, what have you, more sustainable.
Mm-hmm. I would totally agree. I think from my perspective, it's that a lot of especially the large corporates have kind of absorbed and understood that, hey, clean technology, broadly speaking, means saving money. I think that the biggest issue is that the publicly, I guess you could say public facing, the general populace didn't, at least in America, doesn't still fully grasp what it is, what clean tech is, and like why it matters. I think so many people, it just became so politicized that it shoved down their throats. Like even if climate change isn't your first concern, like they were just told that it had to be, right? And they were all of their other like concerns that were above climate or climate change or preserving nature. Those were basically, just thrown to the side and say, hey, those don't matter. The only thing that matters is climate. And it obviously pissed a lot of people off. And they're like, you know what? I reject that. I'm not going to be involved in it. But even as Trump has come in, we see despite them, in order to approve mergers and acquisitions or whatever, like you need to get rid of DEI, you need to get rid of your climate plans, like all these things have to go. But they're still doing it. Like Amazon is still buying EVs. They're still doing all of these things that are more sustainable. Why? Not because they're being forced to by some, Gestapo figure. They're doing it because it saves them tons of money.
Right. Yeah, there certainly are areas of the energy transition at this point where I agree it feels like we've reached some degree of escape velocity, certainly on like light duty vehicle electrification and, heavier duty perhaps as well soon. And, certainly in energy, there's been a massive proliferation and kind of step change in the degree to which companies are interested in this and it actually works for their business models. Yeah, super aligned on that front. Before we go too much deeper, let's give some folks some additional context on the work that you do and how that started. Because I think, I'm really interested to ask you about some of the signals that you're seeing flow through your business because they speak to everything that we're talking about. But before I go to full bore on that, let's get the audience up to speed on what it is you spend most of your time doing.
Yeah, absolutely. If you don't mind, I'm going to back up a little bit because I think it's helpful to understand that I'm definitely an outsider in this space. Like I didn't come from this space by any means. So let me back up a little bit. So I'm from the middle of nowhere, Wisconsin. Like literally, people ask, oh, what city in Wisconsin are you from? I always have to like just point them on a map or tell them, hey, it's like many hours in this direction from Madison or whatever, right? So I grew up in the middle of nowhere, a total hillbilly, basically, like shooting guns, driving dirt bikes, like the whole 9 yards. So that's what I grew up around. So
nice.
As you can imagine, it's like a very deep red part of the country. And, that's honestly how growing up, that's how I identified. I would say that it's still in this way. I have so many kind of conservative tendencies, if you will. But the whole point is whenever people talked about solar or wind farms or everything, it was always like, oh yeah, that's a scam. It's just killing the birds. Like it doesn't make any sense. The general argument was always, hey, that stuff doesn't work because it's subsidized. And
Sure.
again, we're not going to talk about subsidies and with oil and gas and everything, but that was the discussion, right? So I had never had any interest in climate technology or clean tech, whatever you want to call it, because for me, growing up in the woods, nature was something that was trying to kill you at all times. Like you just had to survive, especially with Wisconsin winters. It's like,
Totally.
it literally is to an extent, it's like still survival, right?
Right. It's
So
sort of like the antithesis of having a front row seat to global warming too. You're like, it's pretty soon.
exactly.
It's cold in the winter.
Yeah, we always are like, hey, global warming would be kind of nice because we could get 2 more weeks out of the crop season here. But anyway, so the point is like the fact that I ended up in clean tech is honestly kind of comedy if you think about it. But I got into the space very accidentally. I ended up in sales, and then I met somebody in 2019 who was like, hey man, you sound like a sales guy. Do you want a job in New York as a recruiter in the renewable energy space? And I said, I don't know anything about recruiting. I don't know anything about renewable energy, but I would love to move to New York City.
Right.
I was trying to get out of Wisconsin at that time. So
Yep.
I ended up, long story short, ended up moving to New York City March 2nd of 2020. We all know how that went. But, despite kind of the COVID situation being a little messy, it actually worked out super well for me. And I became, again, I will be very honest, I was like mildly skeptical about like working in renewables. I didn't know hardly anything about the industry. All I knew was that the basic research I could put into was that there was a lot of money going into it and it was growing. So I thought, hey, it's not like I'm going to get probably laid off in 2 weeks or anything like that. So this should be a good move for me.
Right.
But very quickly after I got there, my boss was like, hey man, you seem very interested in this more like startup vibe. Maybe you'd like clean tech. He called it clean tech at the time, more than renewable energy infrastructure. And he was right, because as soon as I started digging into it, I was just mind blown by the innovation in the space because, again, I'm a kid from Wisconsin. I didn't go to college, like no engineering background, but just seeing the pure like scientific breakthroughs, even that outside of the climate part of it was just mind blowing. I was like, there's nothing like this, right?
Right.
And I basically fell in love with the space. To me, I like to put this analogy is that a lot of people look at Rockefeller and Carnegie, and at that time of the Industrial Revolution, it was basically a blue ocean. There was totally new opportunities everywhere you looked. And up until that point in my life, I had been searching for what would that new blue ocean be. And when I saw clean tech, I was like, you got to be kidding me. Everything that we touch physically can be reinvented because there's a more sustainable way to make it. And it's not just because it's sustainable, it's because it's going to cost less. The circular economy component of it was amazing to me. Like just all of these things blew my mind, right? And then I heard about companies like Carbon Cure, I think it's the name of the company, the cement company, right? That were like, we can put carbon into the cement, it makes the cement stronger, and it's lower emissions. And I thought to myself, you're telling me that for the same price, we can have a better product that's also more sustainable? Like, who would not be interested in that? And while there weren't as many breakthroughs at the time, I knew there would be. So I was just wildly convinced of it. And that's what ended up leading me to start the podcast, which is called CleanTech, which you've been on. So that's kind of the beginning of it. And then I'll just fast forward there. I eventually got really frustrated by I guess you could say, disconnect between the recruitment industry and the clean tech startups. Recruitment industry is in some ways like very parasitic, right? They're just trying to go after Series B companies. They make this big announcement that they raised 20, 30 million. And then before you know it, they're getting like calls off the hook from recruiters saying, hey, let me help you hire some people.
I'm sure.
And I got frustrated by just the way that there's so much waste in the recruitment industry. There's a lot of managers who don't do anything, a lot of wasted software that just doesn't need to be there, and just terrible inefficiency. So I said, at some point, this would have been, I kind of finally made up my mind to launch my own thing in early 2024.
Nice.
And I won't go through the whole details of it, but it became very apparent to me there was an opportunity to do so. I had moved back to Wisconsin. My cost of living was a lot lower actually, compared to New York City. And there was an opportunity to start. And I said, you know what, I'm going to do this. And my differentiator is that I'm going to basically reduce all these excess costs so that I can pass those savings along to my customers. So that way I can work especially with the early stage companies, pre-seed, series seed companies, because I saw so many times with the podcast that these companies were never getting to Series A. They just didn't have the right people in place. And it largely came from the fact that they didn't have the money to afford using a recruiter who's going to charge them an arm and a leg, right? So I reduce the cost, I pass it along, and then I get to work with them as they grow. And I will say, man, it has been probably the most rewarding thing I've done so far. Just getting to work with these startups from the early days, see their growth, and make placements in these teams that have material impact on their outputs and their outcomes. We're early days. I've only been at this for 2 years on my own now,
Yeah.
but the growth of the startups I've gotten to work with is really remarkable, and I'm just really excited to be part of it. So that's what I do today. I run Earth Search. We help clean tech startups hire US-based talent, primarily sales folks and hardware engineers. That's kind of the niche that we've fallen into because those
Nice.
tend to be the hardest to recruit for. So that's what we're
Interesting.
up to. And like I said, we charge about half the price of other search firms.
This episode is brought to you by Climate Finance Solutions, the firm helping climate tech companies win the major government grants that drive their scale and impact. Since 2020, they've won over $1.6 billion in public funding for their clients, with a 90% success rate on the dollars that they've applied for. Their team has also helped win more than 500 million euros in European funding and managed over $275 million in grant projects. With a global team of 27 experts, CFS supports climate innovators through every stage of the funding lifecycle, from strategy to proposals to project execution. They also have a grant identification platform that enables real-time monitoring and custom matching of opportunities with alerts as new grants are released. If you're a climate investor, accelerator, or ecosystem builder, you can even join their partnership program to unlock pro bono support for your portfolio companies. Learn more at climatefinancesolutions.com. All right, back to the show.
Yeah, no, I love it. And there's a great sort of analogy between the innovation broadly and clean tech, the space as a whole, whatever we want to call it, that you sort of pointed to that got you excited about it. And, your interest in your pushing of the needle on sort of blowing up the traditional recruitment model to actually make it work for a different subset of companies, and ideally like all types of companies in the long run, I imagine. Yeah, I mean, we talk so often in my neck of the woods of like, a lot of these companies raise venture capital, and that is it's neither here nor there per se, but we talk often about like, especially companies in different stages and approaching different physical, complicated hardware problems. We often talk about like, oh, is this like the right part of the capital stack to be funding this from? I think it's equally valid for us to extend that conversation to things like recruiting too. And it's like, yeah, the way this is done traditionally is not going to work for every company. So the more that we explore and sort of go to market and actually test different models for that, the way that you're doing and the way that you've seen success doing, that type of stuff always gets me excited.
Mm-hmm. I will say too, I think it's evident that the recruiting companies that were in the space were not like again, this is not all recruitment companies, but the majority of them are there to make a buck, and they kind of follow the trend. So everybody, 2020 to 2022, it was just hot to be in clean tech and climate tech. There were so many firms in the space.
Makes sense.
When Trump comes around, usually like a whole bunch of these companies, they just went back to like supporting oil and gas. They rebranded to energy, and they're kind of like innovative like climate side of things went out the window. They still do some work in renewable energy largely, but in the space that I work with, most of the innovation, they just left. And to me, that's a sad thing that they just didn't have the willingness to stick around. There's only me and one other guy who are really like super active in this space. And it's kind of fun to just be like the two guys in the US who are like placing all these amazing folks.
Yeah, I definitely think there will be a lot of long-term benefits to riding a few of the wave cycles and continuing to do sort of like the compound knowledge building and network building. And I imagine, yeah, a lot of people probably did pivot even just to like AI to find salespeople for AI companies and that type of stuff, I'm sure. Jumping ahead a little bit, sitting here this morning, I get less and less reactive to the day-to-day news as I stay in the space longer and just get older in general. But I saw this morning that U.S. economy actually lost something like 95,000 jobs in February, something like that. So at like a macroeconomic level, and, there are a variety of drivers of this, but there's definitely some concern about the labor market broadly. So I'm curious just to dive into what you're seeing at an early stage with the companies that you work with and their sort of hiring demand and the health of the space, as it were. Because you have a very interesting vantage point just by virtue of working with a variety of companies and having some of these signals flow through directly to your business.
Yeah, so I guess there's a couple things I would point out. So number one, I am not the kind of person who falls like super deep, data points about the whole job economy because I'm really focused on a particular segment.
Yep.
But what I would say is there was a major change around kind of the end of the ZIRP era, where instead of just hiring wildly and being irresponsible, which it wasn't just in the clean tech world that was happening, it was happening everywhere.
Right.
Just like completely irresponsible hiring practices. Around that time, things changed, and it became the default to just hire only the right person. And you're better off having nobody in the chair than having the wrong person in the chair. Because especially with clean technology, I think it was really challenging, especially if you're like an energy tech company selling to utilities. The sales cycle is too long to take a risk on somebody. So if you hire a salesperson who's been assigned to enterprises but not utilities, and then they're going to go learn how to sell to a utility. It's a 6 to 9 month sales cycle.
I'm sure.
And by the
Yeah.
time that they have tried to crack the code, it's already too late and they were out of money, right? The startups were out of money. So it became the default advice from VCs was just hire the right people and just be very bare bones. And I would say that's the same today. Like nothing has really changed. The only major change that I would see is one point is there are still lots of companies hiring in the clean tech space. But there are lots of companies that had business models that I just think were either fundamentally flawed or were highly reliant on subsidies. And those companies, in a lot of cases, they're just dead, they're gone, or
Yep.
they're about to be gone. However, there were a lot of companies who had fundamentally correct business models, and those companies continue to do well. However, they're not just going bonkers and hiring like crazy. They're hiring the
Right.
right people as they need them, and they'll rather wait 7 months to hire the right person than they would to just put a butt in the seat and try to make some sales, right? That's what I'm noticing, and it's usually happening in a relatively intelligent way. I would say a lot of the companies have been great at bringing in consultants or fractional talent as necessary when they're really early so that they don't burn their runway down. But they're bringing in somebody who has, let's say, 20, 30 years experience in the space, which is way better than bringing some kid from, grad school who, may be smart, but just doesn't have the battle scars. And this allows them to like really accelerate their growth. The number of companies that have gone in the course of 2 years from just like an idea to having some genuine traction, to me, is really exciting. So still lots of hiring going on, but it's very intentional from what I've seen. And it usually tends to be focused on like the key technical hires, and then the salespeople are usually like the core things. Again, part of the reason why we focus on that area.
It sounds like I think there's an element of healthy sort of disambiguation here in the market generally, sort of discerning, as it were, like what's actually fit to purpose and what, has a chance to compete on whatever sort of problem it's trying to solve, or the team is trying to solve, or the company is trying to solve. There was definitely a lot of, excess. And I think, this is a natural part of market cycles, but in the early part of sort of the climate tech 2.0 boom, there was just there was a lot of money going around, and there was a lot of talent attracted to the space, and that was great because it catalyzed and precipitated a lot. And now we're sort of in the part of the digestion phase and the shakeout phase, but it's good to hear that there's still, plenty of momentum for things that are fit to purpose.
I do think it's worth commenting on that because climate was such a hot topic. There were so many people who wanted to come in and work on the space because they were effectively just like sick of being, desk monkeys, basically.
Yep.
And it was very interesting to see. There's a lot of programs that popped up to help people get jobs in climate, but there's a lot of people who they were obviously not sincere, because now that the tides have gone out effectively, they're not picking up the phone when they hear about a climate job. Like I have noticed that downtick in people when I'm trying to recruit from non-climate industries to bring them in. It's a little less easy to get people on the phone.
Yep.
But also I think that the challenge was a lot of these people didn't understand that there had to be maybe some amount of sacrifice, because they still wanted their cushy, salary and nice kind of benefits.
Right.
And they wanted to make an impact. They wanted both. They weren't willing to put in the sacrifice necessary. But this whole point of digestion of the industry is probably the thing I'm most, I guess you'd say, excited about counterintuitively. Is that because it's not a quote unquote hot space to be part of, the companies that do survive are going to be wildly successful in a quote unquote hostile environment. And when we look at the space in, I don't know how long it'll be, probably 3 or 4 years, we will be really excited by what happened. And a large part of this is because of just poor policymaking. We're actually seeing more innovation and more success because, you've got the energy demand component with AI, the data center build up. He's like all of these things just focusing in on and making us realize that, hey, renewables is the best option still, like as we said, even despite their kind of saying it wasn't. And there's a lot of points I could go into there, but the Trump administration is effectively inadvertently bolstering some of the core areas of this space that will then become huge successes, by the time his administration's over, is my take on it.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely making it more evident more quickly what can stand on its own, without ready policy support, and even sometimes with like adverse kind of policy opposition. And yeah, I mean, I think, to your point, it's definitely going to accelerate the rate at which this industry as a whole has sort of been like forced to get to a point of its own sort of like financial and business model sustainability, right? Like you can build businesses for a long time if you just have like access to infinite, not infinite, but close to infinite in some past kind of corollaries like venture capital or other forms of cheap debt. But the faster you actually need to like get to profitability and you don't have access to that, there are some positive downstream impacts of that for sure.
Yeah.
I'm curious for, because I can definitely sort of, from my seat, imagine what it's like to engage with companies on that side of your business to, sell to them, work with them, help them. I'm less familiar, or at least it's less easy for me to readily imagine what it's like building up sort of the network and the talent side of the marketplace, as it were. So I'm curious just for like a window into the day of the life of how you cultivate and build that sort of repertoire of great talent that you can then iteratively introduce to companies.
All right, CleanTech founders, let's be honest. You need to move fast. It's 2026 and you cannot hesitate. You can't have things dragging you down or slowing you down. So why are you putting off the most critical thing that you can do to help you grow? And that is hire the best talent. We've heard it time and time again on this podcast. The best talent is what helps you grow. The new year is here, and every week that you miss out on hiring that head of sales, that mechanical engineer that you've been looking for some time, you are letting somebody else eat your lunch. It is 2026, and for CleanTech startups, it is currently survival of the fittest. You need the best people, and you need them now so that you can grow your company to where you need to get to your next fundraising round. And you need a recruitment partner who's going to match your energy and not going to slow you down. That's me and my firm, Earth Search. We work as an integrated recruitment partner only with CleanTech companies to hire their US talent, and we can help you with engineers, sales, co-founders, anything that you need, any talent in the US. We know your industry, we know your targets, and we can deliver. If you've been listening for some time, you know that for 5 years now, we have been having conversations with the leading CleanTech entrepreneurs in this past decade. We, as a result of this podcast, have been able to get into rooms that other CleanTech recruiters have never entered. And our network isn't just a bunch of resumes. Because of this podcast and these relationships, we know the people who have been the movers and shakers to actually build the most successful CleanTech companies in the past decade. You will not find more value in another recruitment partner. That we are confident of. We deliver proven talent faster and cheaper than traditional search firms. So if you'd like to get the conversation started, reach out to me directly on LinkedIn or email me at silas@earthsearch.com. That's ERTH search.com. Again, Earth with no A, ERTH search.com. And we'll get the conversation started. We look forward to working with you to build a team of A players.
Yeah, so I would say there's a couple components I can mention there. One is that it's relatively misunderstood that the challenge in recruiting, if you're good at recruiting, is not actually getting candidates. It's actually finding clients to work with, because there are a lot of unhappy candidates. And if you are just good at producing a non-AI message to them, they will respond to you, right? Especially if you clearly have read their experience and you're reaching out. If anybody has a hard time getting responses from candidates, it's probably because they're just doing a very poor job at putting themselves in the shoes of the recipient and saying, hey, this person has like obviously been a salesperson to utilities. I have a really interesting sales role at a company that does the same thing. And, I think there's a good reason for you to jump ship, right? And you can kind of understand where they're coming from. And if you know the space, it's very easy to write those messages. So the finding talent component is usually not too hard. I would caveat that with one component, which is some of the software talent. It's a little harder to find good talent in that space because they are, in some cases, just like getting completely blasted with messages. And they, as a result, kind of just tune out any kind of inbound outreach. So that's one case. But with a lot of these things, it's mostly, hey, I work with a EV charging software company. I can work with these guys. I get to know what they're looking for. I present them to the opportunities, but I just really understand what it is that matters to them. And they appreciate that. They appreciate that I'm not just here pitching one job, because I have multiple roles that I work on, usually at any given time, or I will have new roles in the future. They start to recognize, hey, Silas is the kind of guy who I can talk to, because he's going to keep my information confidential. He's not going to go spread it around and randomly tell people that I'm looking for a job. And he also knows that this is what I'm looking for, and I'm working for these particular types of roles. So by niching down into that area, it becomes a lot easier. And then by nature of that, you also find out kind of what's going on with the companies. I've always joked that I'd love to actually just sell my secrets and not do recruiting. Do recruitment for free and sell the secrets about other companies, because people, when they're disgruntled, they tell you all of the bad things, right? So like, I can't do this because it would just like destroy my career overnight. But it is fascinating because you get to hear all of the dirt about what's going on. And then you, as a result, know, kind of like, hey, this company, I can go reach out to their folks because they're probably, if one person's unhappy and if those things are true, then everybody else is probably unhappy too. So it's not necessarily that hard, but it is fun to be a sort of detective, if you will, and you just kind of follow the clues and see where they lead.
Nice. Yeah, I like that framing. And yeah, we can also sort of frame it positively. It doesn't have to be sort of as you said, we don't have to be sort of dishing the dirt on what goes wrong at early stage startups, but sort of translating that into sort of the perspective on providing insight to early stage companies, not just on how to recruit well, but I think this is ultimately also a conversation about like how to build a durable culture, which translates into building like a sustainable business. What are some of the key things that you see again and again that like make companies that you work with more effective at all these things versus not attracting talent or retaining talent? And also even just like understanding what they need and would benefit from at different stages. Like I think that's all part and parcel of recruiting. There's a lot more to it than just like, hey, here's someone who's interested in the role. Yeah, sort of, I'm curious for things that you see pattern-wise that companies can do to work with you as best as possible, and also just like what you see with the companies that have kind of gone through this phase and have navigated the challenges of it successfully.
For sure. So I think there are a couple things. If I kind of just try to keep me on track here, but I'll try to walk through like early days through to a little bit more scale.
Great.
The key components when you are, getting started with you said your co-founders and maybe a couple early people, is that you're going to need to recruit people who are very much in for the mission. I mean, this is like very obvious to say this, but you need to be willing to go through and sort through the people who are going to be willing to go through that challenging part at the beginning. And what I would really want to point out here is that most people assume that because they are early stage, they can't afford big salaries, that they need to hire junior people who have lots of fire. It's actually not the case. In many opportunities, there are senior people who have tons of experience in that domain who are just so bored. Like they've had a 20, 30-year career. They've made plenty of money. They are so bored doing the same old thing over and over and over again that you can find the right ones. By the way, not everybody is going to be the right fit because some of them are just big company folks who don't understand how startups work and they want so much structure. But you can go through, sort through, and find these people who will join an early stage venture and they'll take a massive pay cut, in some cases like 50 to 60% pay cut, just to join and be part of this. And it's really helpful because they also have this huge experience and wealth of knowledge and a Rolodex of people in the industry that they can bring to the table and really accelerate your growth. So don't assume that you need to hire, junior folks. Obviously, in some cases, that's what you'll need. But in many cases, you actually just want somebody who's been really senior and who's very mission aligned.
Right.
As you grow, I would say the key things are just understanding what is the real skill that's missing and hire for that skill, but also make sure there's alignment with the general company direction. Now, the point that I would say as the founder in this point would be you need to be very clear about what you're trying to achieve and keep that momentum in the public eye. Because even if you're not fundraising, there needs to be some amount of hype about how you're going. Because whether you like it or not, your employees will notice what's going on publicly, right? And it's very easy to go out of fundraising mode and then just go, heads down and start building. I think Liz Dennett is really good at this, of being able to celebrate the real wins, both internally and externally in the company, and then get back to work. Like we can't, I think, David Semler says this if you go to bed on a loss or on a win, you wake up on a loss. And that's the same point, is you have to kind of like weave this thing together. The area where I see people struggle most of the time is that they're just so freaking busy with trying to do everything and keep the company moving. Yeah. And in some cases, they miss the nuances of what's going on in their team. You'll see situations where a junior employee who's been there from day one has kind of become, like the default leader of the team because they were there early and they're a believer. You might need at some point to bring in a more senior person to help guide them. But without them stepping back and thinking about it, they might actually get really nervous or offended that somebody else more senior is going to come in and manage them because they haven't been there the whole time, right? So this can be a challenge. I've also seen the fact that there is a point in the company, usually between seed and A, typically is when this happens. Like once you've hit the markers to go raise your A and you haven't raised your A yet, the company is under the assumption that we have to be startup people and we can only hire startup people. People who come from big companies, they can't fit in the team. While I understand the concern and the risk, you have to be willing to go to that next stage, because no startup company becomes a big company without kind of doing big company things, right? There
Right.
are certain processes that you'll need to put in place. Going to manufacturing is, for example, is like really, really hard. You need
Yeah.
people who know what it actually takes to present to the manufacturing company and say, hey, here's the specs, blah, 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 blah. You need to have those people who have been through the ringer, dozens of times if possible. So
Right.
that is probably the hardest phase I've seen, is like people shift that mindset. Some of the most successful companies I've gotten to work with have been bigger companies that, they went bankrupt and got purchased, and then they're kind of reincarnated with a new sort of energy and new funding. And it's usually very easy for them to continue scaling because they've already gone through the challenges and they have that maturity. In order to avoid going bankrupt in the first place, though, you can just do these other things, right? So those are some of the core comments I would have. The other thing I want to comment specifically on is sales teams. Since we work a lot with sales teams, is you need to have very clear KPIs and objectives for what the sales people need to do, especially if you're hiring your first salesperson. If you are going from founder sales to then try to kind of bring in a junior AE rather than bring in a senior person who knows how to build sales teams, you need to be very cautious. And I shouldn't say cautious, but be very clear on what has to be achieved. If you are a founder-led sales organization shifting over to a junior person who's going to take over a lot of the sales, if you do not know how to build a sales organization, you should probably get some advice from somebody else. I personally recommend going out and doing the same thing I mentioned before. Find somebody who's got 20, maybe 10, 15, 20 years experience in the space building sales organizations, but wants that opportunity to go back to ground zero and to be an individual contributor and
Right.
then build their team underneath of them. It's way more likely, like, especially with salespeople, you would be surprised at how often you can find people who are really up for that challenge because they honestly miss the grind, right?
Right.
So those are some core components I would say. Is like, you have to be clear. The companies that struggle the most with the sales talent is when there's kind of like no direction. You just expect a slightly more junior person to come in and just know how it goes. They don't. That's the whole point of them being junior. They do not know what it means to be self-directed in most cases. Yes, they're an individual contributor. Maybe they're even a hunter, and maybe they were a top performer at their past companies. But the reason is they had clear direction as to what they were going after.
I love that. There's a lot of great insight in that. I mean, I especially appreciate sort of the perspective on how there are sort of nodal inflection points at different company size where if things are going well, there are opportunities for like evolution, but there are also lots of places where sort of, if I put myself in the founder's shoes or the team's shoes in general, it's like there are times, especially when you're hiring someone new or sort of entering a new phase of business growth, where it can become sort of perilously easy to lose a little bit of that sort of like perspective on like actually what exactly is like happening in the day-to-day of the business and like what's going well, and also for like culture to shift. But there are also opportunities to sort of change things and be flexible and test new things that weren't necessarily being done at the business beforehand. And to your point, I think like there's no one size fits all type of talent, whether in engineering or sales, that's necessarily like prescriptively going to work for every company in that instance. So maintaining some of that flexibility of perspective makes a lot of sense to me.
One other thing I would mention about culture building and everything, I talked about this a little bit with public facing kind of wins and everything, is if you cannot find a way to truly pitch what you're doing at the early stages as like world changing type of situation, it's going to be challenging for you. But if you can do it well, if you can say like, hey, there's this humongous market that is basically decaying and falling apart, and we are going to solve it. Even though you may be doing it from a climate lens, you can kind of attach it to the broader market. It just makes it calls people to adventure, right? Like humans, there's
Right.
so many people out there there's a lot of people who just want to punch a clock and make some money and call it a day. But there's a lot of people they are not stuck in the matrix, and they're looking for something interesting. They're looking for adventure to call them out. So I would always just like reference the kind of like the people that do this really well are like this El Segundo kind of crew of people that are really good at, they're working on really challenging things. Okay, I'm not going to downplay it, but the
Totally.
way they position it makes it seem 10 times more important. And that is what draws in investors, but it also draws in early talent. And that's where you're going to find the types of early talent who, in some cases, they may not even have the technical skills, but they have such willpower that you need to bring them on. I was just listening to, I think, Brian Armstrong at Coinbase. Their first customer success guy was a lumberjack before becoming their customer success guy. And they were choosing between him and the person who ran customer success at Google. So it was like, it should have been an obvious choice to choose the person who did the job. But the guy who was a lumberjack, was just like so motivated by Bitcoin that he's like, I'm going to do this. Like they were like, hey, we have to hire this guy. So that's the kind of thing that you can do if you are really good at positioning yourself in the market. Because I think in climate, a lot of times there's this issue where it's like, hey, I'm solving climate change. It's obviously a big deal. And we forget that we need to appeal to things that are more, I would say, visceral, or that individuals are personally connected to, that there is some kind of direct, like, my work will impact this particular visible thing that I can tangibly understand, rather than, hey, my work's going to affect, solving global climate change. Okay, that's important, yes, but I personally, unless my house burned down, I can't necessarily relate to that so directly. If I wanted to relate to it directly and it has to do with my house burning down, maybe I'm going to build a company or a startup that's specifically in like fire suppression or directly related to reducing wildfire risk. That will attract those type of people. But there
Right.
has to be some like human element of this whole thing. And I think this human component, it just in recruitment generally, but also in climate, it's oftentimes like people forget about it, right? There's these companies who say, hey, we're solving climate change, we're changing the world, we're saving the world. But they forget about the human to human interaction they have to have with their own people, and with the impact that these people get to make on other people, right? Nobody gets motivated by, helping some ambiguous kind of thing in the sky. They get motivated by helping their neighbor, by helping the people that they can put faces to.
Right. Yeah, I love that. I mean, you and I are both storytelling guys, so it makes sense that we'd come back to this point. But I do think there's it's a super valuable, it's important to come back to this, that like, whether it's, I mean, people appreciate this readily when it comes to like fundraising from venture or other sources for financial capital, right? And there are a lot of differences between that and recruiting, I'm sure. But ultimately, like, you're talking about attracting the right sort of resources and proverbial energy to your business. And some of it is, people might not always have that perspective when it comes to recruiting, but I think it's probably like potentially even more important that, yeah, offering folks a very clear and like consistently updated, so it remains like true to what's actually happening inside the business, perspective on like what is the value of working here beyond, making some money to support yourself, which is obviously, and your family, which is obviously important too. But I think that's becoming even more important, especially as, we see some deeper penetration of more and more technology into people's everyday working lives, especially in sort of traditional white collar roles with AI and stuff like that. There's a lot of opportunity for, and I see this with people that I talk to, for some of that disenfranchisement, or that belief that like, oh, maybe like we're all going to, like, all the email work's going to be automated in 10 years. And it's like, yeah, some of that might be true, but there's still going to be a massive need for people who can fundamentally just like operationally move the ball forward on all kinds of different things.
Yeah, I think it's worth commenting on optimism versus pessimism. I think that
Totally.
Generally speaking, the one unique component about climate technology companies is you can attract some people who are just like, they're pessimistic about the world situation, right? Like, the world is burning, we're all screwed.
Right.
And I think that in many cases, even if those founders are going out and working on things that are positive to solve the issue, the underlying pessimistic belief is what kind of leads to their downfall in some cases, in my belief.
Yeah,
you have to
definitely
have this
deflating.
like optimistic, we're going to build utopia, basically. That's kind of how you have to think about it. I mean, I think about one of my friends, Will O'Brien, with Ulysses, right? They started out focusing on seagrass
Right.
restoration underwater. And, it's very motivating to them because they grew up by the ocean in Ireland. And they had to expand into other areas where there's commercial and even in some cases defense related markets, but it allows them to get their product created in a very cheap way that will then also go serve the smaller market of seagrass restoration, right? So I think that there's a lot of things you have to just kind of mix these things together, and it's very uncomfortable in many cases, but you have to focus on like, what is the positive vision of the future that we're building, and make sure people get really hyped about that, because that will carry them through all the dark days.
Absent that, it's definitely really difficult to keep yourself motivated and to attract the right types of resources, whether it be people, capital, or otherwise, to your business. And yeah, Will's a great example. I've definitely hung out with him a couple times in person, and I've rarely met people who just had that sort of like consistent and maintained infectious energy of like, oh, like, there are big challenges, structural challenges all over the world, not just in climate, across all kinds of different sort of sectors and challenges and what have you. And, it's what a blessing, what an opportunity to actually like get to work on solving these. And that, I mean, I'm sure you see that even more than I do, but I mean, to me, that definitely becomes, the longer I do this, the more that stands out. And I'm like, okay, that's definitely not a coincidence that those types of founders and those types of businesses seem to have more legs regardless of what they're working on. over time. Yeah, and I'm curious, as an opportunity for other clients that you may have that you'd want to shout out, be awesome to talk about some of those business ideas. I also understand that some of them might, be heads down and not really trying to do too much of the forward-facing press push, but I'm curious if there are other companies that you're excited about that we can chat about.
Oh, there's so many companies I'm excited about. And we're usually pretty public about working with our clients. Unlike most firms, we actually usually post their company's name right on our website. I mean, there's some really interesting ones. I want to shout out probably Helix is one of my favorites right now. Helix Earth Technologies is their original name, but they're based in Houston. And they make this product that goes basically on top of commercial HVAC units and helps remove water vapor from the air prior to it entering the building, or entering the HVAC system, which then reduces the cost of cooling or air exchange by like 50%. So it's absolutely insane technology that was developed by Rawand in NASA while he was there doing his postdoc. And then they spun it out into their own company. And it's one of those cases where it's like this technology itself has huge applications in carbon capture down the road. They were thinking about going down that road initially, but they had humongous traction on the commercial like HVAC cooling side of things, because in Houston, you have to remove the humidity from the air, right? This is everywhere too, but Houston especially is a great market for this.
Yeah, one of the most humid places in the country for sure.
Exactly. And then you also have to, you've got all these like school buildings and all these other places that have to change the air every so many minutes, right? So they have to do these things, and they're able to help them do it for half the price. And it doesn't require you building a new building either, right? They can just bolt this onto your existing system. So companies like that, where they found a way to just reduce cost massively. And there are other like more, I guess you could say, more direct climate implications where they can, then use the technology later on in carbon capture, for example. And I'm sure there'll be others that they'll find, but those are exciting to me. A company that I like to work with a lot right now is called OptiGrid out of Kansas City. They are actually the reincarnation of FreeWire Technologies. So they're really interesting. They're partnered with Orange EV, which is the largest manufacturer of Class 8 EVs in the country. And they're basically going gangbusters. I ended up kind of indirectly placing their CEO. I didn't actually get a fee for that, unfortunately, but I did introduce their CEO to the opportunity.
Out of the goodness
and then
of
we
your heart.
ended up working together to build. Yes, out of the goodness of my heart. No bottle of champagne or anything, but from that referral. But the point is, he ended up coming to me and we building out his sales team, marketing team, and they're just doing some incredible things where fleet owners of EVs have this humongous issue. Like Amazon and FedEx and like all these companies are really aggressively bringing on EV fleets, but they can't charge these vehicles because they're stuck waiting for utility upgrades, which take 12 to 18 months in some cases.
Yeah.
They can bring this level 3 charger that's paired with a battery. They drop it in like a few days and they're solved. Like they get garden hose in, fire hose out in terms of energy for charging their trucks. And to me, these commercial use cases are just really amazing. They have an unfair advantage because they've got lots of capital behind them. But those are some of the companies I'm super excited by. But any company in energy demand, I think especially home electrification right now is a huge opportunity.
Fantastic. Yeah, oh man, it's so fun to actually get back to, it's probably a very exciting part of your job is like the chance to be so close to these startups that are working on really interesting stuff and growing.
100%.
And yeah, it's not that I don't get to do that anymore in my job, but just hearing you sort of tick off a few examples is like, oh man, like 2 or 3 years ago when I was still doing more podcasting and what have you, I actually like got to have a few more conversations like that per week, just with really interesting companies. So definitely goes back to like how to keep ourselves engaged and optimistic. It's like when you actually are in sort of collaboration with some of these folks, or even just conversation, it's like, oh man, yeah, there's a lot of really cool stuff happening on the ground, and even at larger scales. And you don't have to always just like be bleak about stuff happening.
Exactly. That's the whole point. Like as a recruiter, I have to pitch people on joining these companies, right? So I have to understand deeply what's going on with them, and then be able to pitch that to candidates dozens of times per week. So it's really hard to be pessimistic when there is, again, it's part of the function of my job. I have to, but I really just truly enjoy this stuff. Like I recently got to work with Liz at Endolith, and just being able to tell that story to people who are not in many cases super familiar with microbial mining. Like nobody knows what that is. There's a lot of people who are in biology of different sorts, but getting to see that, they were like, oh wow, that's like amazing. And you get to hear the reaction. It's just like when I found out about climate the first time, I get to basically do that for so many people in many cases, that it's really hard to not be optimistic about what we're going to see in the future.
Yeah. And it's also just such a great reminder that this really larger question of how do we innovate and create new approaches, technologies, what have you, that not just reduce cost or like improve direct business outcomes, but also make the world more sustainable. Like it truly spans every possible imaginable application. Like we've talked about grid, we've talked about biologic approaches to mining here. Most recently, we've talked about building hardware for the ocean in Ulysses' case. That's another thing I always come back to is like, man, anytime I'm bored or a little bit like disgruntled with something else going on, it's like, let me just go find something like completely wild and new that I hadn't thought about to learn about.
Exactly. Yeah, there's so many cool companies, man. It's just like it's such a blessing to get to work with these folks. Again, being somebody who, when I first got into the space, I dreamed of, maybe building a venture studio someday to build in clean tech. I became pretty quickly sobered by the idea that I would not be capable. I just don't think I'm the right person to do that. But getting to work alongside these companies who do that and seeing the
Right.
innovation so closely, it's really like a dream come true, honestly.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm confident that you could build a great venture studio if you wanted to, but I definitely think we need folks like you thinking about things like recruiting too, that traditionally haven't necessarily been seen as like as sexy, if you will, for whatever reason. But like, I mean, it strikes me as I think there's a lot of venture capital out there, and it's sort of my call to action for folks listening in who might be thinking about, in many cases, may already be working on something great, but might be thinking about what to do in the future. I'm like, it's always good to consider going somewhere where the puck isn't yet, but should be and maybe soon. So in that vein, before we wrap up, I think it's probably reasonably evident to folks what type of value you can bring to their career or their company, but I want to make sure you have the opportunity to provide those really clear calls to action for yourself and for your business.
Yeah, I appreciate that, man. Now, if anybody's listening and they're a clean tech founder or hiring manager and you need to get the right people in place, whether that's sales or engineering in particular, I would definitely encourage reach out. Even if you're not, willing to spend the money on a recruiter, I'm always glad to give people my 2 cents. I actually am, like I said at the beginning, a lot of recruiters tend to be very parasitical and they just think, hey, come work with me and I'll collect a fee. I actually don't do that. If I talk to people and I can tell they have a really good network in a particular industry, I'll give them my kind of core tips on how to achieve getting those talent attracted to you. Because if you can do it on your own with, a bit of effort, that's not going to like completely sap your time. I really encourage you to do that. Why would you spend thousands of dollars working with me if you can save the money? Because I want you to have that runway to continue growing. So if you
Right.
do need help with something, reach out. I'm glad to give you my 2 cents. But when it comes to, searching the entire earth and finding the best person, or at least searching the best person in the US, whether that's sales or engineering talent, let me know. I'd love to help you guys out. We do this for about 50% of what other firms charge. And the actual level of service that we provide is also at the level of like executive search, where we're doing whole outbound searches. Like the process itself is very white glove. This is not dollar store recruitment. This is the maximum value that you're going to get out of an actual like headhunter relationship.
Love it. Yeah, before we close, I always like to offer up the opportunity to sort of flip the table, as it were. You're a better podcast host than I am at this point. I'm pretty confident about that. So what questions do you have for me?
I guess I'm just curious from your perspective, like what is the thing that most drives you to continue doing Keep Cool? Because I know that your deep dives are just really impressive. I want to understand, why do you keep at it?
Good question. I mean, there's definitely there's a couple elements. I think part of it is I do, especially from, like, I'm a writer first and foremost. I love the written word. If I'm, even outside of work, I love creative writing, and I'm also just like constantly reading, often fiction, not necessarily related to climate. So part of it is like, especially as I've gotten a little bit older, is like really clear, concrete understanding that like for me, writing is just like from a craft perspective, even something that like I'm excited to spend the rest of my life continuing to improve at, and getting the opportunity to iteratively hone and refine some of that skill set in front of an audience on topics that are both exciting and important is obviously a tremendous blessing and opportunity. Then if you like layer in the content perspective, like I find climate and everything related to it, as we've talked about, is just like infinitely, like you can go as expansive as you want, and you can, I reckon it recorded, so I'll just keep going. But I was basically saying, the craft, the opportunity to just like iteratively refine the craft is exciting in and of itself. It's like, I think about like 100 years ago, we'd probably have like a lot, or 200 years ago, there were a lot more people just like farming, but that, and to us today, maybe that sounds boring, but there were a lot of people that actually just like really enjoyed that. And it's like, there's no kind of limit to.
I was just going to say that as a retort to that, I think it's very fascinating to see how valuable writing will become again, or maybe even like more elevated in people's mind, because it's becoming so blatantly obvious that the majority of people write with AI now. Like the patterns, I don't know,
frightening.
maybe other people don't notice this, but I notice it on every single LinkedIn post. It's like the same exact pattern, especially that this new one that AI has come up with. It's not this, it's that. And I'm like,
Right.
guys, like
Negative
it's so
construction.
obvious that you're using AI that I actually think that we're going to end up seeing people value more that human kind of relationship, because they're just like, people think, oh, AI does all these things that's great for you and helps you, but in reality, it just dehumanizes everything. And I think that writing, I don't know what your perspective is on this, but I feel like, as some people might say, writing is like not as important now, I think it's actually becoming way more important that you can write well.
Yeah, I think it's going to become quite clear in many cases where people have taken time to hone that skill set and are still like continuing to practice and flex that muscle. To your point, like there's so much AI generated writing now flooding different channels and avenues. And I agree 100%. I mean, especially for someone like myself who just loves like reading like artfully presented narratives and stories. But I think, yeah, it's the same as like the way that the proliferation of Zoom and working from home has made a lot of people, you know, kind of revert to and crave in-person connection. I think there's a corollary there for writing that is fundamentally like human first, and perhaps like AI augmented and editing or research, or even just producing like a 0.5 draft. It's not like I don't do any of that myself, but yeah, it is very clear.
Yeah, of course.
When people have taken the time. And yeah, in terms of what keeps me going, like the content, as we've talked about also, of just like climate sort of having touch points with everything under the sun. Like there's no limit to how expansive you can take your climate sort of knowledge journey in terms of different industries it connects to or problems that it can kind of help you uncover. And then there's never any limit to like how deep you can go on any one thing. Like the power grid's a great example of like, I've learned a lot more about it over the past 6 years. And it's that classic case of the more I know, the more I appreciate that I don't know. So it's like, there's no amount of additional learning and expertise that you could, like, there's no limit to how much deeper you can go on any of these problems too. And then the third thing I'd say is like, there's a stewardship element to all this, which is important to me too, which is just like, we are fundamentally, it's like, I do not want to be the type of person who is just like mortgaging a future that isn't mine to give, you know, whether or not my hands are like directly involved in like conservation of ecosystems or in sort of stewarding the space as a whole as someone who's shaping the narratives around it. I mean, it's just a great opportunity to say, you know, at the end of any given week or any given year, it's like, oh, you know, making a material difference to make sure that people in future generations like get to still enjoy the earth to the same degree that I did.
Amen. Great.
Well,
I mean, I love it. I love what the work you guys are doing. I'm just like, super excited to be part of this ecosystem still. Like, this is something you vacillate a little bit between, because like, there's so many other challenges or topics we can talk about or you know, focus our content creation efforts on. But so I don't want to be the kind of person who is just like kind of blowing with the wind, because I think you got to put a stake in the ground and stick with it.
100%. Yeah. And there's so much compound knowledge that becomes so valuable and exponential, not just from like a networking perspective, but just from like the way that we think and learn and understand the space. So I'm excited to be in it for the long haul with folks like yourself.
Amazing, man.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Silas. It's been a pleasure. And yeah, happy to be back on Clean Techies anytime soon when it makes sense. And we'll keep it going.
Cool, man.
Thanks for tuning in. So you don't miss the next episode on another cutting edge climate tech, make sure to subscribe on Spotify, Apple, Google, or wherever it is that you get your podcasts. We'll see you soon.
Thanks for tuning in today. If you like the show, please share it with your friends, leave us a review, and be sure to follow Keep Cool, the other podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. Nick does some really, really great work, especially if you like to read more than listen to podcasts. He's got a great newsletter. And let us know who else we should have on the podcast. Finally, one more shout out to our sponsors. Layman's terms, if you're about to do a media appearance or spend time on Capitol Hill, or you're getting in front of investors to pitch, they will help you with your media training to ensure that you don't go viral for the wrong reasons and that you capitalize on the moment. Michael has been working at this for a long time and has a specific focus on the clean tech space. You can go to ltmediatraining.com to learn more. And then we have Climate Finance Solutions. If you need to raise non-dilutive funding, they are the team for you. Go to climatefinancesolutions.com to get started. And if you're looking to hire engineers, salespeople, or executives, just A players who have a proven track record, reach out to me and my team at EarthSearch to help you find them without breaking the bank. You can reach out at Silas at earthsearch.com. That's ERTH. We spelled Earth a little funny, just so we can get the URL. Or you can send me a DM directly on LinkedIn. Most of us are probably already connected. So, all right, thank you guys so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time on Clean Techies.